Welcome to the Create More Value podcast, sponsored by Fortuna Advisors, the boutique shareholder value improvement advisory firm. Create More Value is a series of conversations with senior executives, board members, investors, and other experts that have overcome challenges to create exceptional value for their companies. There are many ways to drive value, so we cover a wide range of topics. I am the host, Greg Milano, founder and CEO of Fortuna Advisors, and I hope you enjoy the conversation as much as I did. I am honored to welcome AnnaMaria Desalva. Thank you, AnnaMaria, for joining me on our Fortuna Advisors podcast, Create More Value.
Greg, thank you so much for having me. I'm honored.
AnnaMaria Desalva is the global chairman of the Burson Group, the global communications leader purpose-built to create value for clients through reputation. She is also an executive committee member of parent company WPP PLC. From June 2019 until July 2024, she served as global chairman and CEO of Hill & Knowlton, one of the world's foremost strategic communications firms. Previously, she served as Chief Communications Officer of DuPont and subsequently as a senior advisor to Ed Breen, the CEO of DowDuPont, as he advanced the separation and launch of new independent public companies. Before DuPont, she was head of corporate affairs for biopharmaceutical innovation at Pfizer and served as the global healthcare practice leader at GCI Group and Hill & Knowlton, which is also when she was appointed by the Commissioner of the U.S. Food and Drug Administration to serve as a special advisor to the Agency for Risk Communication. Earlier, at Bristol Myers Squibb, she led global public affairs for the oncology business and served as director of the Bristol Myers Squibb Foundation. AnnaMaria was appointed to the board of XPO Logistics, a technology-driven global logistics provider, in September 2017, and she became vice chairman of the board in 2019. During her tenure, she led board engagement with institutional investors, advised on XPO's breakup strategy and its CEO succession, and led board recruitment. In November 2022, she joined the board of XPO spinoff RXO. In December 2022, Governor Glenn Youngkin of Virginia appointed AnnaMaria to the board of visitors of William & Mary, her alma mater. Earlier, she served for 7 years on the board of governors of Argonne National Laboratory of the U.S. Department of Energy. AnnaMaria is a trustee of the Committee for Economic Development of the Conference Board, a member of the Committee of 200, and a member of the Economic Club of New York. So, during your career, you've been involved in some of the biggest mergers in history. What have you learned that can help our audience to be more successful in creating value from mergers?
Well, thank you for the question. Thank you again for the opportunity to be with you and with your audience. And I'm going to be referring through the course of our conversation probably to 4 reference experiences. And one, certainly, as you indicated, was the $68 billion acquisition of Wyeth by Pfizer, where I was hired in 2009 to help integrate Wyeth to create a new R&D engine. Then there was DuPont's $130 billion merger with Dow, which led to an historic transformation, creating 3 leading companies. At XPO Logistics, as you just said, I served on the board, and over the course of a decade at XPO, that company really built tremendous value through a series of major acquisitions, and then unlocked more value by resetting the portfolio and doing a breakup similar to the one we did at DuPont. And then now, in my day job at Burson, we are completing the merger of Hill & Knowlton and the legacy BCW Group to create the Burson Group, which is very exciting in our industry and important merger in our context. So, with those experiences in mind, I mean, I feel like just boiling it down to a few things that I hope are useful, some of which may be very evident, but especially in these big, high-risk transformational mergers, some of the ones that especially Pfizer and DowDuPont come to mind, Pfizer-Wyeth, DowDuPont come to mind, really having a strong value creation thesis, like really making sure the thesis, the reason for doing the merger, the transformational strategy is incredibly robustly considered and is, overwhelmingly attractive, basically. And the reason for that is, of course, because especially these big, bold transformations bring a lot of risk with them, and there is always tremendous execution risk. In the case of Pfizer and Wyeth and DuPont and Dow, to an extent, I mean, they had burning platforms. They had urgent, almost existential reasons for doing something so bold and transformational and big. And so, in addition to having the strength of the thesis, you need to have greatness and tremendous skill and wisdom and judgment on the management team and on the board as well. The governance of these big transactions is not for the inexperienced or for the faint of heart. I think that what was so interesting about Pfizer, Pfizer did a decade of big deals. They did going back. I mean, within a decade, they had done a $90 billion acquisition of Warner Lambert, a $60 billion acquisition of Pharmacia, and then a $68 billion acquisition of Wyeth. And that all happened within 9 years or something, or
Mhm.
less, like eight,
Yeah.
8 or 9 years, So, and then of course, Ed Breen, who led us into the combination with Dow, himself, just as a career CEO and a serial value creator and someone who responds very creatively to risk, certainly was a known and trusted figure at a board level, but also with investors in terms of his ability to make a major, truly historic transaction like the Dow-DuPont combination work. So I think that getting back to execution risk, of course, because my background is in communication, you might expect me to focus on the intensity of the demand around how stakeholders are affected by these big mergers
Mhm.
and how problematic it can be if you don't manage your stakeholders well. And so the quality of that strategy, that stakeholder engagement strategy, the communication, the classical change management principles, the surveillance of risk with many different types of stakeholders, and the very proactive action that you have to take to mitigate that risk is essential, really essential for success. And that's true with your workforce, with your employees, with your major investors, but the communities in which you operate and are going to be opening or closing plants in, all of your regulators, all of your local policymakers, and of course, all of our stakeholders today are highly interdependent, they're highly connected. And so you're never just having one conversation with one audience, right? So
Mhm.
it is a really important critical success factor is stakeholder communication and engagement needs to be superb with these big transactions. People are always at the center, and those stakeholders are people, and they have wants and needs and emotions and buttons, and they have grievances and they have concerns, and they have fears. And I think keeping people at the center of the strategy with a lot of with a sense of pragmatism and realism, but also compassion and empathy,
Mhm.
is very powerful. The people you could argue who might matter most are the people who are going to take you forward, and the people in the organization who have given a lot to get the legacy companies to this point, and
Mhm.
then are also critical for the future. And so I think having a very people-centric approach is really important. And we saw that very dramatically at DuPont, because, Ed was a new CEO and he was the first outsider to ever run the company in, a couple of 100 years.
Mhm.
And he was not known to our people. And so we began a program of communication internally that was very considered and very comprehensive and very consistent and very frequent. And over time, that care with which we surveyed our employees, with which we, had a regular program of town halls, with which we dealt forthrightly with their concerns. The data showed that over time we were able to build confidence and trust, and eventually we got to a place where our scores for confidence and trust were actually better than they had ever been, even while we were in the middle of this like extraordinarily disruptive transformation. So that was, I think, very motivating to all of us. It was enlightening even to those of us who had been around for a while and done these things before.
Mhm.
It was extraordinary to realize that just through the discipline and the care and the commitment, and the quality of the way we were executing, that we could make that type of a difference. And actually, our team, the communications team, was recognized by our profession, our industry, the communications industry, gave us highest honors that year because of the progress we were able to make in the middle of such an historic merger. Just borrowing a little bit from the founder and chairman of XPO, Brad Jacobs, who is another, he's a serial entrepreneur. He's created extraordinary value, in creating, at this point, probably something like 10 companies. And he's done more than 500 acquisitions, and he's raised more than $40 billion of capital.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, he's sort of a little bit in a category by himself. And so when you talk to Brad about mergers, one of the things that he will talk about is speed, not to compromise quality, but to move the integration as quickly as you can, to rip the Band-Aid off and just not drag it out and not put people through more uncertainty for longer periods of time than is absolutely necessary. And then, finally, just one or two more points that I think are really important that I hope are helpful to people. You can't underestimate the importance of brand strategy. So when you're creating a new entity through a merger that has a new, better, improved proposition, even if you're sticking with the name and even if the brand is going to cohere because it's a truly an acquisition, it's still a really important moment to reset the brand strategy and the platform and the way you activate that brand and create a new experience for your stakeholders. In some of these transactions, you're creating a whole new brand,
Mhm.
and you can't do that tentatively. You can't do that eke it out a little bit at a time. You
Mhm.
need to bake that in to your program, your plan, and also your cost for getting the merger done. And there's been a lot of work that will show how effective that is in terms of return.
Mhm.
I've done a couple of university lectures on this topic, and I always save a section at the end that is called the chapter is called Managing Yourself Through Radical Change.
Mhm.
Because having been through these big transactions, it is very stressful. And it doesn't matter how good the corporate athletes are or how experienced they are. I've watched so many of my colleagues. I've looked at myself in the mirror and I've seen the fatigue, and
Mhm. Mhm.
I've seen the strain of getting these big transformations done quickly.
Mhm.
And I think that we sometimes underestimate, what we have to do to take care of ourselves to be able to show up and make these sorts of things happen and have a great outcome. And so, I do think we don't talk about that enough, but I think ensuring that we maintain our own resilience and that we know how to protect and extend our own stamina is a part of being successful.
Yeah, I mean, you've said so many great things there. Just a couple of things I want to emphasize. I mean, the way you built trust during the big merger, I think you said at DuPont, is really particularly notable because I think even in like upper middle management, but right down through the employee ranks of a company, there's often a lot of skepticism when a big acquisition's going on. They
Yes.
think, oh, this is all padding the pockets of investors or executives or something, and they become skeptical. So to build that trust at that point was really good. And I think the other point you made, which I wanted to just emphasize before I go on to my next question, is that gone are the days where you can have a communication with investors and a separate communication with employees and a separate everything you do now is kind of open to everybody almost.
Yes.
And so you need to, when you're thinking about each of the stakeholder groups that you want to communicate with, you have to do it in such a way that you could expect all the other stakeholders to see it as well. And it really, yeah, that's a really good point. I hadn't thought of it that way, but that's really really important. So that was just
and
a
and
great
and
summary.
there are nice, yeah, there are nice synergies there too, because I really do feel that sometimes when you do really great work internally for your internal audiences, it makes your external work better.
Yeah,
When you work really really hard to tell the story to investors, it becomes a basis or a platform for your engagement with so many other stakeholders, even if the details are different or the technical approach is a little bit different. So usually there's a lot of interdependency, and you can leverage that to your benefit.
yeah, yeah. I mean, I've seen the opposite done, and where you tell one story to one party, you tell another story to another party, and then when people find out, what you told the other party, then the skepticism grows pretty quickly because you're not telling a consistent story to everybody. But
Yeah.
so formally, your field is communications, but just knowing you, you seem to have a pretty broad impact on strategy and value creation. How do communication strategies help to create strategic value in a company?
I think that is a great question, and it's also incredibly timely and incredibly relevant today, because what I see from my perch in the industry is that communication really is becoming ever more central to value creation and is
Mhm.
seen that way by management teams and boards and is being, valued that way. And the expectation is quite high in terms of the role that communication needs to play in the enterprise. And that's because, communication strategy is animating the things we do commercially to drive growth, the way that we manage our risk, and the way that we build our reputation. And if you unpack that continuum, growth, risk, and reputation, you see that the marketing communications disciplines are changing and becoming more powerful and becoming more distributed, and the center of gravity of the things that we have to do to communicate effectively and the most relevant way to reach the target consumer the most effectively is becoming very much a science, and has always been an art, and the art will always persist
Mhm.
as being the way that we inspire people and touch both minds and hearts. The risk equation is critical because of everything that we worry about with reputation risk, issues in crisis preparedness, individual stakeholder risks. And so risk management, really becomes a large part of the role of a chief communications or chief corporate affairs officer. From a reputation standpoint, what's so interesting, I mean, we know that at least 25% of a company's valuation is often attributed to the intangible asset of reputation. We know that companies that have stronger reputations have 2 to 3 times greater revenue growth. I mean, this is all well documented in the research. But we've known those things for a while, and what I feel like has changed is the awareness of boards and management teams that a good reputation, you can't just count on a good reputation being the outcome of a well-managed company. Maybe at one time it was just sort of a very natural consequence of having good effective operations and good values and good principles and good leadership. And that's really no longer true. Companies are understanding and realizing that they have to be much more vigilant and much more proactive in managing their reputations, understanding what the drivers are, understanding what the pressures and headwinds are, and very active risks that can escalate at any given time, regardless of the quality of the company.
Mhm.
And so we do see certain companies, including those in very regulated industries, elevating reputation management and reputation risk to the charters of certain board committees. So sometimes it will be the audit committee. The poor audit committee is like a little overworked these days and
Mhm.
is taking on many risks, of course. But sometimes it's the audit committee that will be looking at longitudinal reputation risk data and performance data year over year.
Mhm.
There are other companies that are creating different types of committees focused on public responsibilities or public policy, or they have different names. But when you study the charters, you begin to see reputation is gaining as an active governance topic and consideration for boards. So I do think that when you consider the role of communication in growth, risk, and reputation, the importance of reputation from a governance standpoint, the fact that our stakeholders are so knowledgeable and demanding, and the challenges that we have today around mis and disinformation, and around polarization, it's difficult to even sometimes talk to your audiences, or know how to do that
Mhm.
and not aggravate a certain situation unintentionally. So I do think that communication has been elevated as a discipline that
Mhm.
is central to value creation, and I think that the people who have those jobs, they're in more demanding roles now. They're sort of in the hot seat, and they better be successful in the way they advise their CEO and their management team,
Mhm.
and they are in front of the board frequently, and the advice and the counsel and the decisions are material.
That's great. You're just listening to you. I think I could listen to you explain this all day long. Your ability to talk about how to get through to people and how, you frame things, and the importance of the communications just comes through really strong. So if we go back to Pfizer, DuPont, and now Burson, of course, what kinds of, again, aside from the acquisition conversation we had before, what are the kinds of kind of communication approaches and insights and outcomes can you share?
Yeah, so it's sort of a slightly personal story, reflecting back on Pfizer years, because it was an incredibly important, inspiring effort to be a part of, to really be focused on transforming the R&D engine of the world's largest pharmaceutical company, and knowing that failure was not an option. I won't get into the details, but it was a very challenging time in terms of the company's valuation, in terms of investor sentiment, in terms of the visibility of some really large, late stage, expensive R&D failures. And so this transformation had to be successful. At the same time, you heard me describe earlier, there were three major tens of billions of dollars worth of hundreds of billions of dollars worth of acquisitions done in the space of 8 to 10 years.
Mhm.
And the organization had change fatigue. Like, it was visible to me. I was new there in 2009, and it was visible to me. I could see it, I could feel it. And it's really concerning your scientists, when the people who are really meant to invent and to see the possibilities and to bring together capabilities in totally innovative ways, are not motivated. It's very concerning, and it's sad. And just at a human level, and I guess as a communicator, I was sort of vibrating with that. Like, I could see that and feel that, and I felt like it was a part of what needed to be addressed. And ultimately, in addition to all the great change communications and change management that we had to do to take billions of dollars worth of cost out of the organization quickly, we also decided to reconnect to our purpose, to our passion, to our mission. And we created what is essentially, in normal parlance, might be like a hero's journey. We didn't call it that, but we did call it a journey. I talked about, the journey to three horizons, and we ended up calling our program that. And, thinking about the three horizons that we always have to navigate, and that I think you and others have written about. But in the first horizon, how you have to deliver today. We had the imperative to deliver the portfolio. Do not take your eyes off the ball. At the same time, we knew we had to move Pfizer science and R&D past the small molecule and into many other important modalities of treatment, and conduct different types of science than the company was conducting. So it was like innovating new capabilities. And then in the third horizon, looking to the future and understanding, what is the ecosystem, the R&D ecosystem of the future?
Mhm.
How are we going to deliver transformational cures in 10 or 20 years? What will be the problems of the world that we need to solve? And to own all three of those horizons, and to engage each one of our scientists to understand the role they played and their connection to the body of work that was connected to each of those horizons, and to get comfortable with the idea that we had to be able to do all of those things, and that your ability to invest in the third horizon, you earn in the first horizon, right? by
Mhm.
by delivering on your commitments, and making the business work. But we relied on storytelling. We at a year beginning meeting, our president of R&D, who was the very gifted leader, who was actually capable of leading this type of transformation and could integrate science and business, and had the integrity and the credibility of being a scientist. He was so unusual. And he also, when I raised the topic of storytelling, he didn't think I was crazy. Like, other people did, but he didn't think I was crazy, and he embraced the concept. And at a year beginning meeting, he unveiled, the new R&D story, and there are beautiful storyboards on stage. And he told the story. He relayed each chapter in terms of our challenges, in terms of our strategic response, in terms of our commitments, and a vision of the future, looking ahead a decade. And he made it very personal, and he talked about his sense of mission and purpose, and he let us all know, how he went from being basically a pediatric oncologist in Sweden to going back to get, I don't know how many different PhDs he got, um, to become a research scientist, and to ultimately lead these large pharmaceutical R&D organizations. And it was a very personal story he told about his patients, and about wanting to have impact at scale. And we went around the whole room and spent the hours and the time exploring people's stories.
Mhm.
And it was like a prayer revival. And it was so moving. And later, like a year later, as the scientists actually got into the exercise of telling their personal stories, the next year we had this wonderful actual storybook, like low tech, high touch storybook of the stories that we had surfaced across each of the horizons. They were beautifully rendered. Of course, we did get a little bit of professional help because I learned that scientists tend to write in abstracts. So we got a little bit of help, so that we could bring out some of the story
Mhm.
a little bit more in each
Mhm.
case, but with everyone's participation and agreement. At that time, the new CEO of Pfizer, then new CEO of Pfizer, got the book, and he came over to me that day at that meeting in Florida, and he held it up and he said, "AnnaMaria," he said, "I never knew that there were such heroics in R&D."
Hmm.
You know,
Wow.
so telling the stories was so revealing, even to lifetime Pfizer executives, and it was so motivating to all of us. So I think I would be mistaken if I were to sort of claim or even think that was the most substantial element of the transformation. But it was, you're asking me for experiences that were unusual and things that I learned. And I mean, the power of storytelling and the power of lifting people up and making sense of all those mergers that had come before, and
Mhm.
understanding that we were going to have a more focused R&D engine. We were going to spend less money, but it was going to be more powerful. We were going to work all three of those horizons. We were going to add modalities, and we were going to be more successful. And when you think about the outcome there, it that was a successful R&D transformation. And a
Mhm.
decade later, uh, something like 90% of Pfizer's candidates were all like first in class products. Like it
Mhm.
was all innovation, and a focus on 5 therapeutic areas. And then I couldn't even count the new technologies and modalities that they were able to bring in online. So that was really, I was so happy. By then I'd gone to DuPont by the time that decade concluded. But Nature magazine, the scientific journal, had this great article and editorial about the successful Pfizer R&D transformation, over a decade, and it really just came together in a very powerful way. But I do think that, I thought that the Dow DuPont transformation was incredibly courageous, really, really difficult. But the foresighting that board and management successfully undertook was very powerful, because I just really think that, when you look at what's happened in the chemical segment, if DuPont and Dow hadn't taken that action at that time, they would have lost a lot of value, because there were innovative parts of the company that would have been dragged down by the more cyclical parts of the business.
Mhm.
And so combining for 2 years to figure out what was the right way to go to market as 3 new public companies, and how do you reset these portfolios to create more shareholder value, was a very intense and difficult but worthwhile exercise. It was Ed Breen who really taught me a lot about the relationship between risk and creativity.
Mhm.
And he used to talk about the 10 to 15 decisions that he has made as a CEO in his whole career that have been the most consequential. And he would talk about how many of them actually start from the position of solving for risk, solving usually for strategic risk. And that if you have a great relationship with your board, you can explore that risk and come up with things
Mhm.
that you probably otherwise wouldn't come up with. And, I think that we saw certain risks to our business in agriculture, and that really sped up the whole idea around creating an agriculture pure play. And when Corteva started, it was trading at about $26, and it's trading in the 60s today. And it's just been, it sort of in a category by itself. It doesn't have a lot of competition based on what role it plays in customers' lives and in the world. So I learned a lot from that transaction about risk and creativity. Um, I could go on, but I feel like I'm talking too long. So
No, it's fine. I just want to comment about what you just said there about DuPont and that big transaction. I think it was very bold. I think I had worked with DuPont, so I knew DuPont fairly well. I didn't know Dow at all, but when I first saw the announcements, I thought, wow, if they can pull that off, that's going to be amazing. But
yeah,
certainly there was a lot of sense of or valid questioning of can you pull it off, because there's so many things had to fall into line. But the idea of taking two companies that have diverse portfolios of activities, combining them, and then separating them into three much more focused portfolios where the businesses and the business models are more similar just makes such perfect sense. I mean, I've done so much research in my life to show that companies with a lot of different types of businesses just on average don't do that well. The conglomerate model was an interesting idea, 50 years ago, and
yeah,
GE was always the company everybody held out to say, well, it worked there, but not anymore. So I think that was a very bold thing to do, and I think it was strategically a great idea. Um, watching it from the sidelines, I'm sure there was a lot behind the scenes that had to happen to make that happen. And I think the other thing, going back to your Pfizer, illustrations, I think the storytelling part of what you said is so important. I find you can communicate facts or information to somebody one way, sort of just very traditionally, or you can communicate that through a story. And when you communicate it through a story, it's just so much more engaging to the person that listens to it because they get to really associate with it. So I think that was really important in getting the research people on board at that point. So I thought that was a great story also. So I'll change the topic a little bit. So how did you wind up serving on public company boards of directors, and what have you learned in those experiences that you can share with the audience?
Well, thank you for the question. One big takeaway that I'll just leap right to, which I hope is helpful to someone who might be listening, is take the meeting. The One of my big learnings from my board service is to be very open and to, when someone wants you to have a new experience, try to lean into that opportunity, because there was a third party, there was a recruitment leader who wanted me to have a conversation with XPO Logistics about an executive role. I was in the middle of all that transformation at DuPont. I did not want to change jobs. And I didn't think it was the correct opportunity for me. But this was someone I knew well and trusted. And he said, I really wish you would take this meeting, even if it's not for you. This is a company you should know, and this is a CEO you should know. And boy, was he right, because it was just an extraordinary company at an extraordinary time. And the founder and CEO and chairman, Brad Jacobs, is a singular leader from, he's just an extraordinary entrepreneur with an extraordinary track record of success. And so getting to know him and talking about the business and talking about the role of communication and talking about the transformation and the scope of the ambition and the opportunity was very illuminating and educational for me. And then eventually, even though it was evident to both of us that I wasn't going to join the company as an executive, at some point down the line, I think it was a year later, he asked if I would consider joining the board.
Hmm.
And then that became another longer conversation to be sure that that was the right thing to do. And then I did join the board in September of 2017. And I think that what made me relevant was the transformation experience. So I think he respected the work that had occurred at DuPont. I think he respected our executives at DuPont. He really understood the challenges the company was going to face from a communication standpoint and from a stakeholder relations standpoint, because the company was big. It was 100,000 employees. It was almost $17 billion in revenue. It was global in its footprint, and it had been brought together very rapidly. And it didn't have like these big corporate functions like a Pfizer or a DuPont.
Mhm.
And I do think something that I should also acknowledge is in those roles at Pfizer and DuPont, because communication was so central to the transformation, is I was like working further upstream on business strategy. So at that point, I had, I think, knowledge and versatility in business,
Hmm.
and I think it isn't always appropriate or logical that a functional leader would go into corporate governance. You can be a great functional leader and never have a board seat, and that's fine. That's
Hmm.
completely fine. You can still have a great career. I think as an executive, like really leaning into the difficult assignments that really stretch you and give you that experience and transformation are so helpful if you want to go on to lead a business in an operating role, or if you want to be involved in corporate governance. So that's the story of how I joined that board. We eventually broke that company up, and then I went on to one of the SpinCo boards.
Hmm.
But as vice chair, as the NomGov chair, I was really involved in everything the board did with our institutional shareholders, and I led those engagements, and I led the special engagements we had with major institutions during the pandemic when there was some interest in how these frontline essential companies that were keeping the world going during the pandemic, how they were handling their workforces and their risks. I was really involved in helping to think about the breakup, forming the new boards, backfilling, refreshing the mothership board, the XPO board, and also working with Brad and others on CEO succession as he made
Hmm.
changes in his portfolio. So that was almost 7 years all in of board service there,
Hmm. I
and
think
it
it's
was
great that you got
wonderful.
involved with the investors. I recently spoke to a fairly large asset management firm. Their chief investment officer is a longtime friend of mine, and he spoke about a company I won't mention, but he complained because they want to meet with the board members, and management is sort of blocking it and not allowing the really any of the board members other than the chairman to speak to the investors. And I
Mm.
actually think it is a pretty good thing for investors to get to hear. I'm sorry, for the board members to get to hear what the investors have to say.
Oh,
It's useful
yes.
the other way, but the feedback loop of it is also very good. So it's not being filtered by management and the IR department, but you get to hear directly. I think it's easier to fill the role by allowing those communications to happen. But the management sometimes are worried about not controlling the dialogue, and that's why they block it. But I think it's great that you were able to communicate directly with investors and board seat.
It's a very interesting, important dynamic between board management and, for sure, investors. And I think that we had a principle at XPO that the board none of the board didn't never wanted to become a burden to management, never wanted to distract management, and yet at the same time we had tremendous access to the management team and tremendous access. We were always invited to the quarterly operating reviews. We got several times a month, we received employee survey data. We received the same research, like reams of research that were published every weekend on the industry. You know what I
Hmm.
mean? Like
Hmm.
we were, and during the pandemic, when the world was in crisis and supply chain management and transportation companies like XPO were on the front line, we were a part of all the operating committee calls. We were a part of the crisis management response team calls, and there was no separation, and we didn't interfere, but we had real time perspective and information, and that became really important because when I got on the phone with a coalition of pension funds that wanted to talk to the pandemic 50 companies, and they were
Hmm.
concerned about human capital management, and I was able to talk about the quality of our safety, the fact that our employees had better morbidity and mortality rates than the general population, the
Hmm.
extent of the board's involvement. It turned into a very positive conversation,
Hmm.
and so I think that it was very interesting to me and unusual, I think, that XPO had that balance of communication and interaction between board management and investors.
Hmm. That's great. It's really great. I'd like to ask you just one final question. Are there any final messages on how our audience can be sure they will create value in their day-to-day jobs? Are there any traps to avoid that you've seen? Any sort of big overriding messages you want to share?
Well, I feel like, and I assume that significant management responsibility. I just feel as though there is such a challenge right now for all of us to transform our businesses without compromising performance. And I feel like that's kind of the juggernaut right now is to really do it. And you write, you're so focused on this. I feel like in terms of the focus of your advisory business, basically how do you perform and deliver and create space and opportunity and investment in the future. And I feel like that's kind of an exquisite balance that everyone really has to strike. And
Mhm.
while discipline, cost management is always so important, we have to do it really well right now, because we have to create and innovate. But the more effective we are at managing today's costs, perhaps the more opportunity we have to reinvest in the innovation going forward. I also feel that a lot's been said about how leadership demands are changing. Since the pandemic, leaders have needed to be very connected to their workforces and playing other kinds of roles, like just taking a very human approach to leadership and to building the right tone at the top and the right tone within the organization. And I do think not just in the United States, but elsewhere, we're seeing more polarization. We're seeing more stress in the workplace. They don't really want to deal with politics at work,
Mhm.
but sometimes it can't be avoided.
Mhm.
And the data is beginning to show us some real problems. And if the workplace isn't unified, if it isn't an exciting place to go be productive and to draw on the strength of the diversity of ideas and the diversity of people who come from different contexts, then we're really slipping backwards. And I think
Mhm.
that was
Mhm.
always so much, the joy and the advantage of going to work. It was a place where you could do important things with different types of people
Mhm.
by necessity and get big things done. And so I do think that leaders have to be aware of that and be thinking about how to set the right tone and temperature and be inclusive and create the right environment, and to unify people and to bring people together. So I think it's an amazing time to be alive. I think it's an amazing time to be in business.
Mhm.
I think that for all of our challenges, we have to be incredibly optimistic and hopeful and have high expectations for what all this change, the benefit that all this change can bring us, and the courage to work through the related challenges. So that's
That's really great.
what's in my mind.
Yeah, I really appreciate this. I want to thank you very much. We've been speaking with AnnaMaria Desalva. Thank you, AnnaMaria, for joining us for this very important conversation.
Greg, thank you again for having me. I hope it was helpful.
You have been listening to Create More Value, sponsored by Fortuna Advisors, and I am your host, Greg Milano, founder and CEO of Fortuna Advisors. I hope you have enjoyed this episode. Fortuna Advisors helps companies with strategy, capital deployment, business management, corporate culture, and incentive compensation, all aimed at driving top quartile total shareholder return and the equivalent for private companies. To learn more, contact us at info@fortuna-advisors.com.